Welcome to Reading D&D Aloud with Ben Riggs, Dr. Scott Bruner, and today's very special guest, Dr. Christopher Robichaud. Today's episode is entitled Vampires, Combat is War, Combat is Sport, and Satanists at Harvard. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and good night, Internet folks. My name is Ben Riggs, the controversial raconteur of the D&D history space. With me, as always, is the one, the only, the man, the myth, and the legend, Dr. Scott Bruner.
Good morning.
And
everybody.
today we have a special guest, Dr. Christopher Robichaud. And would you give us your CV, Doctor?
It's a bit all over the place, but right now I'm a senior lecturer in ethics and public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. I've been there for close to 20 years now, and I do a lot of teaching of ethics and political philosophy. And what I'm probably most known for there, relevant to this, is I design a lot of simulations that help people learn about thinking through hard ethical and political philosophical issues. And all of that simulation design is based on 40 plus years of playing Dungeons and Dragons.
And I'm not going to bury the lead here. One of those is a zombie pandemic simulation, correct?
Indeed, you can see my TED Talk where I talk about designing a zombie pandemic way before COVID. I was ahead of the times, right? In fact, I felt at times like I was in a Twilight Zone episode because I designed simulations around hospital emergencies, having to distribute scarce resources. I've designed simulations about a pandemic. When the pandemic hit, some of my students reached out to me and was like, "This is just like the simulation." I was like, "Let's hope not, because it's a zombie simulation." But I don't know, for better or worse, I'm designing an alien invasion simulation. So buckle up, folks. Who knows what 2025 or 2026 is gonna bring? But yeah, I designed a zombie pandemic simulation to help people learn about leadership and ethics.
And you and Scott really got rolling before I hit record here, and you were having such an interesting conversation. I was like, okay, I got to hit record. I've now learned my lesson. As soon as the guest gets on, I'm going to hit record from here on out. But you were saying that you were a friend of Joseph Laycock, who was previously on the show. And can I ask you to begin that story over again? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. So I think I'm forgetting which book of his he quoted me, but you can find this on Medium. I wrote a piece defending the right of Satanists to perform a satanic mass at Harvard. This was some years ago. It was unfortunate. It was a really slow news week because this became a national story. I didn't quite know what I was getting into at first. These folks had petitioned to do this. One of my former students was in charge of deciding who gets to do this or not. She reached out to me and said, "This seems right up your alley." So I met with them. They were really cool. This is the Satanic Temple, right? They're really cool people. And I was like, yeah, they said, "Would you mind giving a little bit of a talk at the beginning on free speech and free religion?" I was like, sure. So I wrote up this thing, and then they plastered not the Satanic Temple, but like just the school plastered signs all over campus. "Come see Professor Robichaud talk about satanic mass." And like I said, it was a slow news week. I ended up I'm on MSNBC with Chris Hayes debating a Jesuit priest. This is how this week turned out. They never ended up having the satanic mass on campus, but they did end up having it at the Hong Kong here on Harvard Square, which no good story ends if you're at the Hong Kong, in the wee hours of the morning. But it was a good experience, and from the thing that I wrote, I said that if people push me on why I would defend the right to do this, I'd blame it all on playing Dungeons and Dragons, because
exactly
a child of the born in the 70s, but a child of the 80s. Stranger Things basically is exactly my time. And I remember, which we can talk about if you want, or I can also shut up if you want. I remember when there was I grew up in a small rural town in Northeast Ohio, when there was a meeting at the local library to discuss this terrible thing, Dungeons and Dragons. So that was quite an experience. I've never quite forgiven folks for what we had a police officer there dressed as a police officer, regaling us with stories about how he was trying to stop someone, arrest them for some other reason. And they were playing Dungeons and Dragons, and they revealed to have supernatural strength when he was trying to arrest them. We had a psychologist there who insinuated that Dungeons and Dragons was likely to cause people to kill themselves. And I'll just make this full circle. I'll just take it full circle. What led me to defend the Satanists was when this thing all blew up, they reached out to me and they said, "You don't have to do this if you want." So I was sitting at home at night. I still had cable news. I was sitting at home and I was flipping through the channels because this was all on cable news. And there was someone like the bishop or the archbishop of the Boston area was being interviewed, and he was very angry. And he was looking at the camera, and he said that this thing that was going to happen at Harvard was the most serious moral atrocity that the church has ever dealt with. And having grown up in the 80s and know the kind of abuses that people close to me experienced with some Catholic priests, I want to be careful here. I'm still raised Catholic and, take the faith tradition seriously. But I listened to that. I was like, you know what? That is such a crock of horse shit. I reached out to the members of the temple after that. I said, you can put me on any show you want. And some of that was the kind of nonsense that we've been dealing with since the 80s, protecting folks from Dungeons and Dragons when there were other people, there were actual predators that people needed to be protected from that you would have never guessed at that time. So, it was a hell of
I've done some of my best work in anger.
yeah. So, there you go. So there's the story. But I love Joseph's work. It's really, really great stuff. So I'm so glad you had him on the show.
It's funny. I was recently running a Shadow Dark game, yeah, for folks that are a little bit younger than me, and it's every time I have to tell the story about the Satanic Panic and explain that this was actually a real thing, I am always met with these like blank stares. Like the Dungeons and Dragons, I think, is so contextualized now as very much a game, very much as like something you play, like Angry Birds. Wow, that's it. That's almost as dated as D&D now. But it's interesting to me. I get these kind of blank faces. Like it's hard for people to actually accept, how like you talking about, a policeman being there, folks coming there and be like, this committed suicide. Like as as I grew up with it, the way that it always manifested is how like there was a significant percentage of kids that we couldn't invite to our D&D games, right? And I wonder. It's interesting. I wonder what there's something to that made it so, Dungeons and Dragons rested rather comfortably in kind of like, the 1980s heavy metal and all of those things that were just slightly scary that in some ways we've kind of lost in some ways, both for better or for worse. It's much better that we have a larger group of folks that are able and willing to play. At the same time, there's, we've lost a little bit, and this has been a recurring theme in this podcast is what do some of the like kind of strange, uncanny, forbidden lore feel that Dungeons and Dragons has been lost as it's become even more and more and more accessible. And of course, we're standing on the precipice. We're just about to by the launch line of a new edition that's going to take that even further, where it's really designed.
Here we go. Here's our new start to this thing.
Look at that. Look at that.
I've been flipping through it. It is a formidable book. It is close to 400 pages long. But no, you're right. It was countercultural at the time, right? It was a little bit forbidden at the time. And now, if people, when I would say to people from the corner of the cafeteria where I was ostracized, I play Dungeons and Dragons, they were sort of this like, oh, really? Tell me more about that. I don't know anything. Now you can jump on Twitch, you can jump on YouTube, you can jump whatever and see never-ending series of people playing Dungeons and Dragons. It's so popular. It's a strange thing to experience.
It is. I feel like in some ways the way that we kind of grew up, those of us who were fans of Dungeons and Dragons, or we're allowed to play it and we're able to kind of access and understand like what a kind of, I shouldn't say, I hate to use revelatory new medium because I don't think any media are necessarily new, but at the same time, it was one that was really, really exciting for those of us who kind of grew up with it. But it also probably created a little bit of a contrarian streak. You talking about defending the Black Mass, like I kind of resonate with that, or the fact that it actually got you angry at like the absurd hypocrisy of that situation. I feel like if you played Dungeons and Dragons in the 70s and 80s, and you saw the hypocrisy of people not saying that other kids shouldn't be playing, and you're like, this is the coolest game ever. It's just a game. I wonder if it doesn't build a slight contrarian streak of those of us who actually, lived through that moment.
I think it does. I remember my mother took me to my mother, God rest her soul, but she was a great defender of my right to play Dungeons and Dragons. She's a very Catholic woman too. So I remember being in the basement of the library, the local library, hearing these testimonials about how bad it was. And there was really the strong suggestion that Dungeons and Dragons gave you kind of satanic power. And I had some of my friends there, my mother was there. I just leaned into my mother. I was like, how am I playing this game wrong? I want some of that. because we're just eating Doritos and Mountain Dew, right? And we're like, I don't have it. None of this power's happening right now. I'm happy if I roll a 20. That's that there it was at the time. So
Well, I will brutally segue here with a tantalizing hint. My understanding is that more big people from Wizards of the Coast will be gone in a relatively short period of time. I don't want to say any names yet. But whatever is happening over there with people with a decade or more of experience leaving the D&D brand, it is continuing. You guys want to say anything about that tantalizing hint, or should we talk about vampires?
I'm very excited.
You're very excited about the layoffs?
I'm very no. Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say Brutal Segway is one of my favorite heavy metal bands. Second, I really do want to get to the vampires. I don't know any of this because, as you know, I'm usually out of the news sphere of D&D. I'm both extremely curious, but I've got both my vampire things here set up.
Well, let's do it.
I'm so excited to hear exactly what direction we might go in with with vampires.
Should I read 1E and then you want to read 5E, Chris, or do you want to read both? Or
actually, if you don't mind, since I'm wearing old school shirt here, may I read 1E?
Do it.
Yeah,
I'll read 5, and we'll talk about 1E, and then we'll go to 5E.
Okay. And do you want me to screen share while I do this, or do you want to screen share, or does it matter?
Given the recent problems Wizards of the Coast has been having with people sharing images from their books, I'm going to say let's not do that.
Oh, what a shame. That's right. I did read about that. That seemed to be a bit of a problem on their end, PR end. All right. It's a shame if folks don't see this. It's a shame. Can I just do a quick
let's do it anyway.
Yeah.
Let me enable screen sharing.
Yeah.
Because I just can't believe that they're going to come after us for a book that's been out this long.
I'm sitting here and I'm realizing that, we've been reading the Advanced Dungeon Master's Guide for like 300 years and we've never thought to screen share. And I'm like, wait a minute, we could have been showing some of these illustrations.
Right.
We're so unused to video. So go ahead,
true.
Doctor. It should be enabled.
All right. Do everyone see this?
Oh, yes.
Right. See, this is the thing. Look at this vampire. I just love this old school stuff so much. Right. This is Christopher Lee. This is Bela Lugosi. All right. So this is taken from Monster Manual 1E. Here's our vampire. Frequency rare. Number appearing 1 to 4. Just as an aside, could you imagine 4 of these things when we get into them at one time? A low armor class, which means they're going to be tough to hit. Movement 12, 18. Hit dice 8+3. I'm not going to go through all this. Just want to point here. Number of attacks 1. Damage attacks 5 to 10. So what is that? D6 plus 4. Is that it or something like that?
Yeah, D6 plus 4.
Right. Special attacks. This is what we'll focus on. Energy drain. Plus 1 better weapon to hit them. They have some magic resistance. They're exceptional intelligence. They're chaotic evil. Not just typically chaotic evil. They are chaotic evil. Medium size and no psionic ability. The most dreaded of the chaotic evil undead is the night prowling vampire. These vampires must rest in a coffin or similar receptacle during hours of sunlight, unless far beneath the surface of the ground. And in the latter case, they must occasionally return to such rest for their powers restored by contact with soil from the grave. Like all undead, vampires exist in 2 planes at once, the material and the negative. They have an 1876 strength. Remember those old slash strengths. If a vampire scores a hit on an opponent, this is my favorite part. It's a powerful blow that causes 5 to 10 hit points of damage. That's still not powerful even by 1E standards, but okay. But here it comes. And its powerful negative force drains 2 life energy levels from the victim, complete with corresponding losses in hit dice, ability level, attack level, etc. Is my print wrong? Am I missing the part where it says there's a saving throw? No, I am not. There's no saving throw against this. I don't know how much of this you want me to read the whole rest of it?
Yeah. We tend to be brutal. I'd say read the whole passage.
Right. I love this because this is sort of a walk through the literature of vampires too. Vampires are affected only by magical weapons. They regenerate damage at 3 hit points per melee round. It brought to 0 hit points by combat. The vampire is not killed, sorry, but it's forced into gaseous form. It must then return to its coffin within 12 turns, rest 8 hours, and reform a corporeal body. Sleep, charm, and hold spells do not affect the vampire, neither do poison or paralysis. Vampires take only 1/2 damage from spells based on cold or electricity. A vampire can assume gaseous form at will. Likewise, a vampire can shape change into a large bat whenever desired. Thus, the flying movement shown for this monster. If it gazes into a person's eyes, the vampire will have the effect of charming, with the victim subtracting 2 from the saving throw versus magic. Charmed persons behave as if they'd been successfully struck with a charm person spell. All vampires have the ability to summon creatures to aid them in subterranean surroundings, usually 10 to 100 rats or bats, the latter only confusing and obscuring opponents' visions, not physically attacking them. Thank God, right? Because it's a terrible enough encounter as it is. And in wilderness surroundings, typically 3 to 18 wolves, these creatures come within 2 to 12 melee rounds. Vampires recoil from strong garlic, the face of a mirror, or a cross, or several other holy symbols of lawful good, if any of these objects are presented boldly. Note, however, that none of these devices harm or drive the monster off. They do cause a vampire to hesitate 1 to 4 rounds, which might be enough time for you to get the hell out of there before attacking in the case of garlic. A mirror or holy symbol will cause a vampire to position itself so that the object is not between the vampire and its intended victim, or the vampire have one of its creatures remove the device whose power is keeping it at bay. It must be stressed that lawful good holy symbols such as the cross are sovereign against vampires of all sorts, regardless of the religious background of the vampire in its human existence.
That is fascinating.
Isn't it? Right? A vampire can be slain by the following methods. Exposure to direct sunlight kills the creature in 1 turn and becomes powerless immediately. A vampire immersed in running water for 3 melee rounds is killed. Vampire loses 1/3 of its hit points per round of immersion. If a wooden stake is driven through a vampire's heart, it is killed, but only for so long as the stake remains. To finish the task, the vampire's head must be cut off and its mouth filled with holy wafers. Holy water splashed upon a vampire causes 2 to 7 hit points of damage per vial full, which strikes the monster. Any human, this is something that when I was preparing for this, I had forgotten this paragraph. Any human or humanoid drained of life energy by vampire becomes an appropriately strengthened vampire under the control of its slayer. This transformation takes place 1 day after the creature is buried, but if and only if the creature is buried. This is the part that I've forgotten. Thus, it's possible to have a vampiric thief, cleric, chaotic evil in vampire form, of course. If the vampire which slew the creatures itself killed the vampires created by it become free-willed monsters. Vampires of the Eastern world are invisible. That gives them all the appropriate consideration for invisibility, including a negative 2-on-2 hit dive roll for opponents not able to see invisible objects. These vampires cannot charm, however, nor do they have the power to assume gaseous form at will.
Wow. Okay.
What a horrible monster to fight.
I'm gonna set a 10-minute timer because I feel like if I don't set a 10-minute timer, we will talk about this one entry for the rest of the show. So I'm setting a little timer. Who wants to wade into this first? That is a rich field.
Well, first of all,
how would you take it all away, Scott? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I just want to say, I wasn't going to say 10 minutes is just not enough to kind of
exactly.
Go over these things. The first thing I want to say, it's interesting, and I don't understand how I missed this intersection. I am running Curse of Strahd tonight, and one of the things that happens in Curse of Strahd is that generally there's the party's supposed to meet Strahd a few times and actually fight him. And I don't know why I didn't even think about this until now, but tonight is one of those sessions. So I'm running Curse of Strahd just a few hours later today, where the party has to battle Strahd, and it's interesting. We haven't got to the 5e one yet, so I probably should not say too much, but it is interesting about certainly, and again, I'm a bit of an old school adherent, big fan of these kind of things, but there is the most fascinating thing about this is, as you mentioned, is how it's kind of like a walk through the classic mythology of the vampire, and how the first thing I'm always going to think of is how you ludically translate this thing that's existed in literature from Bram Stoker to, basic to folklore into something that can actually be played, and how it's trying to capture the pure fear and horror of that. The other thing that I'm thinking about so much was how, I guess this relates to Strahd in some ways, and I'm getting away from necessarily from the rules, but I was thinking so much. I think everybody knows the story around what Tracy Hickman's game. They were playing a very much kind of like a funhouse dungeon, and behind one door there was a vampire.
That's White Plume Mountain. I think that's White Plume Mountain, where you got the vampire, right? But just there's vampire in a room, just sitting there. Yeah,
exactly right. And that was the inspiration for them to again write the original Strahd, because they were like, this is this amazing, intense creature that has all of these abilities that obviously should have some kind of horrific backstories. How it became a spawn, how it became a vampire, and then of course that was the genesis of Strahd. I want
to make one quick interjection here and say that I have an interview with Tracy Hickman where he talks about it. It'll be in the show notes. Please continue, Scott.
Yeah, fantastic. But it is really, yeah, I don't know. I don't like vampires. I've never liked vampires. We started with talking about zombies, which I love so much more. In some ways, like the whole dressing of vampires, I've always found kind of strange. At the same point, And that's neither here nor there. I think it's really fascinating. And my question to the both of you would be, how successful do you think, and I'm assuming this is Gygax, I'm sure he's got help of folks. How successful is it that he has turned this mythical, horrific beast into something playable? What did he do right? Does he do wrong?
Yeah, so I'll just riff on that a little bit. First of all, Ravenloft is my favorite of all time. I cut my teeth on I6 Ravenloft. I've been running it and Curse of Strahd for basically every party that I've ever run stuff for. Sometimes people try to hunt me down after running these things because I really do play up Strahd and his antagonism. I just love it. And I love that story that you shared. I remember that story as well, which is, yeah, we need this character, this creature is much too rich to just have put into a room. This does, though, to me, and one of the topics I know that we wanted to cover is the difference between combat as war versus combat as
Hmm.
a sport. To me, this first edition Vampire really emphasizes why combat at war was a mentality.
Yes.
Because when you see this, you do not want to mess around with a vampire. You don't want to just sort of just go in there and say, well, we're just going to compare our power set to its power set and see what happens. Level drain is horrible. I really never liked it because it's so meta in a way. I mean, it's you're draining. What does it mean to drain levels? I mean, but at the same time, put that aside. We can talk about that if we want. No saving throw, a single hit
Yeah.
on a vampire takes 2 levels away from you. Absolutely catastrophic. So of course you're going to go into fighting a vampire prepared, or you're not going to go at all. You're going to go in a way. You're going to
Right.
have your steaks. You're going to have your garlic. You're going to have your holy water. It's going to be daylight outside. It's not an accident to me that Ravenloft, the original Raven. By the way, one of my proudest moments at Gen Con. This was like a decade ago. I sat down at a table that was Ravenloft from dusk till dawn. We played until it got to be in the
Oh my
dawn.
God.
I survived. I got the award. My character survived, and of course, part of it was luck. But I played the paladin, and partly I played the paladin because in the older editions they have a +2 across the board on saving throws. I was like, I know this module well enough to know it is going to be save after save after save, but you don't even get a save with this. Point being, you would run screaming. Forget the cleric in their turn. You would run screaming from a vampire until you could confront it, very well prepared. And in Ravenloft, the fact that you have to have your holy symbols and your sun swords and all the rest of it to even give yourself a chance against Strahd is no accident. And I think what we'll see is that's just different than the fifth edition. You can kind of mix it up with a vampire without having to do a lot of that preparatory work.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm absolutely struck by that concept, and what a great monster to talk about Combat Wars War, because this is a monster you're talking about, like, oh, there's things you have to do to prepare, but so much of this stat block is around like why you shouldn't confront it. I'm almost curious as to how Tracy Hickman's script did this. It's like, who wants to be level drained? It's literally the most annoying thing that could have happened to you in early editions of D&D.
Right.
It's extremely vindictive, and but it's in like this is a monster that is not meant to. It's funny because again, I'm running fifth edition Strahd tonight, and the whole concept of bringing in you know this since you've been running it quite a bit, and the book keeps telling me you've got to bring in Strahd early because you've got to demonstrate to the party. I mean, this is so combat is sport. I know we haven't got the fifth edition one, but this is so different. The concept is they have to run into Strahd a few times to know to have some kind of introduction to what he can do, to both be like he's really tough, but to give them some like kind of preview of like when we finally meet him in the castle, in 2 months when we finally get there, you have some idea of what you're trying to do. But it is so, I hate to use the word gaming. There's got to be a better version. The 5e version is so much more like these are the abilities. It's like a puzzle that you can solve. You just got to figure it out in the right context. Here, it's like this is a puzzle that has no interest in allowing you to solve it. If you know,
This
I
to
love the
me,
concept of
Can
four vampires. We should do four vampires in
we
a
mentioned
room.
we mentioned 4 of these things. No, this to me. I'm sorry, Ben. Did you want
go
to?
I was gonna you go ahead and respond. After that, I would like to read part of the original post that introduced the idea of combat as sport versus combat as war on EN World from like 12 years ago. But go ahead.
Right. So no, Scott, what you said there to me is one of the things I hope we could sort of lean into during our talk today is a tension in the earlier editions of the game. I say tension because I think it's a resolvable tension, but it's a tension all the same, which is when combat at war is kind of the default, and I think the vampire stat sort of shows the most, one of the best examples of that. The tension is I remember growing up having all these monster manuals and all these monsters in Dragon magazine. You just collecting all these monsters.
Hmm.
So many of them really shouldn't be fought by the
Yeah,
players. So many
yeah,
of them should be avoided at all. So the tension here is you want players to confront some cool monsters, and as a dungeon master, which was mostly what I played, you want to play monsters, but at the same time, really, you don't want the PCs. You want the PCs to be smart enough to circumvent the monster or
Yes.
to best the monster without having to get into it. Because if they're getting into it, they've already lost, as a sense.
Yes. Yep.
So back in 2012, a poster named Dazter uh, posted to EN World a post entitled "Very Long: Combat as Sport versus Combat as War: A Key Difference in D&D Playstyles." And it is a long post, but I feel like the most important two paragraphs would be these. Quote, "People who want combat as sport want fun fights between two at least roughly evenly
Hmm.
matched sides. They hate, quote, ganking, in which one side has an enormous advantage because of superior numbers, levels, strategic surprise, etc., that the fight itself is a fait accompli. They value combat tactics that could be used to overcome the enemy and fair rules adhered to by both sides rather than looking for loopholes in the rules." And I'm going to skip a little bit and go to the other side of the debate is combat as war. They like Eve style combat in which a lot of fights, sorry, I'm saying this wrong. They like Eve style combat in which in a lot of fights you know who was going to win before the fight even starts, and a lot of the fun comes in from using strategy and logistics to ensure that the playing field is heavily unbalanced in your favor. The greatest coup for these players isn't to win a fair fight, but to make sure that the fight never happens. And either of you know anything about Eve Online?
I don't know much about Eve Online, but
I
I like the that piece was really great.
Yeah, other than again, Eve Online tries to be stunningly realistic, and somebody described it as spreadsheets the game, so
Yeah.
I can imagine how, in that combat it would be very realistic, so which would probably be like war. All right, you want to talk about that, or should we read the fifth edition
I
Vampire?
I want to make this is a bit of a footnote, but we're defined by our digressions, right? One of the things that I find interesting is we've been talking about first editions very much in this kind of combat as war. Like one of the things is these monsters are really meant to be the monsters from mythology. And if you read those books, if you read the classic literature where these things are coming from, it's there. Groups don't often win against some of these kind of larger villains. I was thinking in my head about a little bit about like Fafhrd and Grey Mouse, or how they're kind of constantly running from things that are well beyond their ability to deal with. But that wasn't my point. This is my footnote. It's interesting. A couple of years ago, I'd finished running the entire Slave Lords module series for a group that really came into the entire thing of a combat as war perspective. And it's funny because we're talking so much around how first edition was combat as war, but a lot of those tournament modules were actually, and this is a claim I'm making. I'm curious if we may not want to discuss this, but this would be something for the Discord group, is that those modules were actually very combat as sport because they were, and just like a sport, they actually had scores because groups would go through some of those origin modules and try to get the highest score that they could possibly do. My group, because it was part of a campaign, went through all of the slave mode modules as combat as war, and we were thinking in old school perspective, but we found quickly that those modules were not set up. They weren't. I shouldn't say set up. They were fine, but there were all these like encounters that were supposed to be gone through, one by one by one. And all of my group was doing was, turning invisible, using dust of disappearance to go around the entire thing and just find where the slave lords were at the end. And then, of course, like, crumble the building around them so they would all be, and that was it, right? And it was amazing how some of these modules went really, really quickly. So I guess I just wanted to throw up a complication that it's interesting to me that we think about First E as combat as war almost all the time. And yet a lot of those early modules and adventures didn't always follow that,
No,
maybe.
if I can expand the footnote, so the footnote is
Yeah.
going to become the text.
Do it.
Uh, but right, this is just it, because like, so here's so one tension is, here's all these monsters that would be cool to play, but it sure seems like part of the goal is not to face them. And Scott, to what you said before, and some of them are mythological, right? You
Hmm.
didn't walk into Medusa's lair ready to
Hmm.
fight. You try to find the thing that might give you a chance to beat it.
Yes.
You're absolutely right. When people talk about old school, sometimes they're like, we ran from everything. I'm like, then you obviously never played a tournament module.
Yeah.
So what were the workarounds? To me, there were at least two workarounds, meaning how do you lean into combat in a combat as war background? One was party size. Those tournament modules were often groups of like 12 people or something
Yeah.
like that, as I
Yeah.
remember. And numbers sometimes matter. My old game, when I was a player a million years ago, I was among one of 12 people. plus the hirings, plus the followers. So
Yeah.
sometimes you could balance things just by the numbers that you were putting out there. Something we don't see in a lot of fifth edition play now is groups of 12 people because it's
Yeah.
really hard to have any kind of a combat that will last forever. The second thing was, as we all know, like there was an expectation of you walking into a lot of these things after the first couple levels with a lot of magic, with a tremendous amount of magical aid. It's not to me an accident that as the game starts shifting more towards up here combat as sport while still staying with the older edition, the Dragonlance modules, you start with characters that are like third level or so, but they have
Yeah.
like magical items that are absurd, or Dark Sun, which doesn't even bother having you start below third. These to me were the fixes that the game was trying as more people leaned into combat at sport, but the underlying rule set didn't lend itself to that as easily as later rule sets. Yeah.
I think it's, one of the things that's come up as we've been reading the Advanced D&D Dungeon Master's Guide is how much the Dungeon Master's Guide is very much a response to players constantly trying to break the game. I mean, we literally have this, Gary Gygax is seeing all of the weird things that people were doing to kind of, get past all of the monsters and the slave lords modules or whatever tournament modules folks are going into. And one of the things that I love the Advanced Dungeon, the AD&D DM's Guide, but you can see a certain, like, I would almost use the term flailing at being like, all right, in just like the description of the spells. Okay, you can't let the players do this because that would be, that's going to mess things up. You can't let the players do this and mess it up. And I don't know if that has ever necessarily been solved, but it's interesting because players are extremely creative. And again, when you've got monsters this tough that can drain a level, can you really blame the players for trying to find every possible advantage they can?
Absolutely not. And Gygax, I love his way of trying to like. I remember I'm a big King Kong fan. I'm a big monster fan, right? So speaking about, so I love Isle of the Ape, even though it's a substandard module ultimately. But I love Isle of the Ape, and I love how it starts. It's like this is a high level adventure. It's meant for 18th level characters. You read the introduction to Isle of the Ape. It's like, all right, so they're going to this like different plane of existence, and the first thing that happens is basically all their magical items disappear.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
like, so this is how you balanced it, Gary. You got rid of all the stuff that would actually make some of this. It really is an interesting to think about how I agree with you completely. Gygax was always sort of trying to catch up with the way that players were
Yeah.
breaking the system and breaking the spells too. Because let's admit it, I've survived many an encounter by a careful reading of certain spells in the old school and seeing what they did and did not allow you to do.
Well, the one thing I want to throw in here is um, altering play styles and thinking about how I've approached death at the table. Fairly early on, with the people I play with, we just kind of realized, when your character dies, their story ends, and that's kind of why we were there. So death, and again, we didn't play a ton of D&D. Death became a very rare and very traumatic and very socially uh, difficult experience. People would talk to other people about it and storm out. And to me, it is interesting that in that playstyle, you're telling the character's story, but that other playstyle where you're going to get less attached to your character and death is more common, oftentimes it feels like you are testing the player's ability to be clever and overcome obstacles rather than telling the character's story. And it certainly would seem that those two different playstyles, one will lean into combat as war and the other would lean into combat as sport. Anybody want to say anything, or should we read the 5e vampire?
We can go to 5e, but I will just say that yes, one of my never-ending conversations, both online and with many of the players I play, is this notion of, story. I tend to play up old school attitude, even when I'm playing fifth edition, which is your characters could die. As it turns
Yeah.
out, a lot of the characters don't die as often as could happen. But to me, without that risk of death, and I've had many people come to my table who've been in games when there was really no chance of death, and they kind of find it refreshing to actually have to make decisions in a context in which their characters could perish. But what you've touched on, Ben, is something that, as you know, shows up in a lot of these discussions, which is when a challenge comes to a player, what's the first thing that they do? Do they look at their character sheet and look at their power set
Yeah.
and see which is the set of powers and feats and skills that will help them solve this? Or do they think about this as a player in a sense and be like, how can I navigate this situation that gives my PC an edge? And that really is a big difference.
Yeah, I want to talk
Go,
about that,
Scott,
and
go,
I
go.
know that we've got 5 we've got to get to, but I think it's so. I just started a Shadow Dark game a few days ago, and it was
I'm so
again as I
envious, by the way. I really want to play Shadow Dark. I have it. I've read it. I love it. I just want to play it.
Well, the Roll20 is out there. I'd be happy to run it. I it was interesting because they were all new players, all coming from 5e. And I have to start out, I have to start off with, and I'm just running a one shot. It was actually people who were kind of curious about the game. And I was like, well, here's how we're going to do it. You're like, you have to be prepared. It's going to be the lethal, the lethality of this is going to be higher. It's also not necessarily, Shadow Dark, sure, but definitely 1E was, I think a word we're kind of dancing around, is much more capricious. There are moments where no matter how good you're playing, you can run into a monster that has no saving throw. It's going to drain your levels down and you're going to be gone, right? It's going to happen. What about poison in first edition, right? It isn't, you get caught by a poisonous, you could be level 10, you get caught by poisonous spider. You just have a poor roll on a D20, and that's the end of, Lord whomever, or Miracle the Chaotic. Sorry, Miracle. He lives forever. I should have picked on someone else. But it's fairly capricious, and you've got to be prepared for that. But what I'm thinking about, what struck me was this. I talked about 5e. When we talk about combat as sport, we think about it more as we're approaching 5e as a game. And where I would say first edition, and I don't think the affective thing is that different. I think we get just as effective or just immersed in 5e as 1e, but there is a different moment where there's a different level of distance between the two. Because if you meet a vampire in first edition, it's like you're standing there meeting a vampire. Like it feels more, I would say it in some way, I would say verisimilitude, but it does definitely feel real when the tension is so high, when the monster is so dangerous. And this is a moment where like, what are we doing here? With 5e, it does feel like and I may be wrong here, but I feel like there's the same distance you might have by playing Risk, where like, okay, these are representative. And maybe this is an argument for those of you who are scared about the Satanic Panic, because I would say in some ways there is a more present terror in early first edition rather than 5e, because even though my party tonight is going to meet Strahd, and I know that they're going to get a little bit nervous, and probably there's a little bit of anxiety. Generally, even I know I'm not going to take them out. It's supposed to be a preview, and I'm basically, all I'm doing is previewing the things that the army from Australia can do. I'm showing these things. So
Why
it's
the Australian army?
I was thinking a Risk. That's where you should always
Oh
start
yeah,
with Risk,
yeah.
right? You should go. I'm just picking on Down Under today. I don't know. I guess my point is it's interesting to me, and this is just I'm throwing something out as a probe. Is it that 5e is almost more like you're looking at pieces on a board rather than you're actually inhabiting those pieces?
I, I think for a certain kind of player, I'm one of them. It sounds like you are too. Absolutely. I
Hmm.
think there might be some people who listen to this conversation saying, "What are you talking about? 5e is where I became completely immersive in the
Yeah,
narrative."
yeah.
But that's also because of to me, one of the interesting. I like tensions, right? One of the interesting tensions of 5e. So, I'm slowly reading through the new player's handbook, and a lot has changed, a lot hasn't. But it's striking to me that they put a lot of how to play the game right up front. This is going somewhere, trust me. Right? And so have three pillars of D&D 5e. Three pillars always: social interaction, exploration, combat. Half a page in the new player's handbook. Half a page is social interaction. 2 page and then an example. So half a page of rules and example. 2 pages are exploration and then an example. 8 pages are combat. But of course, then there's 200 pages of character exceptions to the combat. The point is that Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition is still a rules light game when you're playing social interactions and when you're doing exploration. It becomes more game-y when you get into combat. So I can understand why some players playing 5e would be like, "What are you talking about? It's deeply immersive." If they're leaning on the rules light social components of it, it is. But I don't know how you play 5e when you're emphasizing combat, to Scott's point, and not think about it as a distance in which this is a game, power sets matching power sets, versus in the earlier editions when some of those, my friend, my dear friend, my friend of a lifetime, will never forgive me for poisonous spiders in Ravenloft. It wasn't even in Ravenloft. Some of it was in Ravenloft. Some of it was in the Moat House in Temple of Elemental Evil. Because you're
Yes.
right. One bad save and you're
Yeah.
done. And that just creates a different dynamic of immersion, a different kind of immersion.
I would throw out briefly that the best times I've had playing and running D&D are when I am afraid of death for my character.
Right.
Um, and I think that does set up this running tension between people who are dearly attached to their bard from New Jersey. But and I'm rambling off now.
Yeah, but
Uh,
can I
so I
footnote
want
that?
to I want to say one thing really quickly.
Yeah.
Hey, Chris, could we do the 5e vampire next week at this time? Can you come for a second episode next week?
Can you tolerate me for another episode?
Is
Because if
that,
so, absolutely. I feel like we've just scratched the surface. This is a
okay,
good
good. So
conversation.
that opens up some space here. So Scott, go ahead and you were going to say something, right?
Well, I'm struck by you basically providing illustration for, Chris has been saying this concept of tension, like and how important that is for that. Like, how do we lean into those moments? I've talked a lot about, and you know that I like to I like to stay away from saying, well, Dungeons and Dragons is a totally new medium or whatever. But one of the things that I think that it does really well is kind of create that tension. And it does come from this concept of how can we immerse somebody in a character? How can we make somebody feel that they're actually facing a vampire in a room? And I do think that's one of the things that Dungeons and Dragons or any tabletop role playing can be really good at. As soon as once you're saying, hey, you're in charge of this character, this character has backstories and ambitions, and you are kind of inhabiting it for a little while, it in some ways that makes it easier to create that kind of tension. Also, the other thing is, the and we've talked about this before, to me the Venn diagram of teaching and dungeon mastering is so similar because both of those things you're trying to create an experience. You're right, it's not supposed to necessarily be a lecture, it's not supposed to be telling somebody. It's one way is like, how can you actually, and I don't want to use the term manipulate, but how you create an environment that has some type of affective response for the person that's in it, whether it's a pedagogical perspective with a student that you might have, or whether it's an entertaining one. But tension is so important to that, I think, in Dungeons and Dragons. Hopefully, not too much in the pedagogical side, but tension is so important because that is one way that you can really get people immersed in the experience that they're having. Like, I mean, is there? I always, I was a film major before did anything else, and I always thought horror movies were like the best expression of cinema because there's one thing that cinema could do better than anything else. In some ways, I think that's true in tabletop role playing. Again, if you can get that fear, if you can get that horror, maybe that's one of the reasons that from Ravenloft to Curse of Strahd, it remains one of the most compelling adventures of all time because it so much leans on making people feel uneasy in some ways, and it's often both from Hickman to is it who designed this
Perkins did 5e.
that's what I was supposed to say. I couldn't remember the name Perkins. Have been able to kind of take those concepts and implement them so well.
I think it's so insightful to sort of point to this notion of tension and an experience and see why Dungeons and Dragons seems to lean on so many horror tropes and why we could get into like what happened to Ravenloft in the second edition and all the rest of it. Maybe at another time. But I do agree that creating interesting tension has got to be part of what we do. Of course, it's art rather than science. I have some players that really, I've known some players who really just want to sit down at the table and more or less know that they're going to get out of every encounter. They're just going to
Yeah.
roll some dice and see the rest of it. And, I'm not criticizing that. That's, I don't criticize any kind of play. That's the kind of play that they want. That's the kind of play that they want. I would find that after a while really quite boring. One of the things that makes, so you were mentioning Strahd and why Strahd has remained so famous. I also do a lot of deadly dungeon crawls. And even though for some people it's not their thing, one of the things I love about deadly dungeon crawls is you just don't know what this room is going to do to you. And there's
Yeah,
that
yeah.
same kind of tension, and it almost is never how it seems like it's going to be. There's always some discovery. Oh my God, what is this next room going to bring to me? And that's going to be so much fun. Yeah.
I want to briefly return to my religious obsession, and simply point out that the vampire in 1E as written, it specifically says he's repulsed by crosses and holy, or they are repulsed by crosses and holy symbols. And to all of the people who were like, this is clearly a demonic game, one of my current responses is actually Christianity's kind of written into the rules, guys. Like, you have vampires repelled by crosses. That means that Gygax is writing in there that Christianity in some way is valid and true. And I think a lot of the people who were saying D&D was satanic were ignorant, confused, and really interested in gaslighting people to sell books like, who is seducing your child for Satan. But it's really interesting to me, again, to come upon a piece of Christianity just written into the rules as being true within the world of D&D in the 1E rules, which I find fascinating.
It's
Yeah.
fascinating. It's also, I'm sorry, Scott, please.
No, no, go ahead.
I was going to say it's fascinating, but it's also like, it's not a criticism, it's more just an observation. Here's Gygax, and he's giving us Greyhawk, and he's giving us all these fictional worlds. And yeah, why are crosses written into, like, in some sense, like that should be the last thing that you would think
Yes.
of, just because, like, how did Christianity suddenly show up in this fictional thing? I think there's a real tension. Again, tension. But there is this happens more than once in the earlier editions of Dungeons and Dragons, where there's not nearly as much of a divorce from our world as we may have want, up to and including, speaking of this, and this is what got D&D into some trouble, but I kind of love it. There were stats for Satan that eventually came out in Dragon Magazine. You actually had stats for. In fact, you can find them in Best of Dragon Volume 2 now, or something like that. You can find stats for the hierarchy of hell. And of course, I mean, some of it, if I'm remembering correctly, I hope I'm remembering this correctly, because it struck me as the time. Satan has something like, of course, 666 hit points or something like that.
That's brilliant. I was about to say the same. Yeah. It's funny. I was about to say the exact same thing. In fact, I want to emphasize this concept that the first sentence is they recoil from face of a mirror or a cross, and then it says several other holy symbols. Well, again, Greyhawk, Mystara, Forgotten Realms, doesn't matter. None of them have crosses in it. So why lead with that? That's the one thing that's the least likely holy symbol that any party would actually have. So it is a strange moment where, again, the editing of these books sometimes is a little spotty, but it is an interesting concept that here we have cross, despite the fact that I've never in all of my running of D&D have ever had actually anybody play a cleric that is part of, the Judeo-Christian, explicitly Judeo-Christian in any way.
Right. No, if we want to go there, then we go to, what is it? Ars Magica or something like that. Then you go to the, like, fantasy. So that was the White Wolf people before they did vampire and something like that. That's where that lives, basically. Where you have magic in Christendom. But Ben, to your overall point, of course, right? I mean, all of us playing this game knew that most of the time it defaulted into fairly clear good versus evil, even when there was complicated levels of gray. And you'd have to be purposefully obstinate in seeing how this game actually played out to think anything else. But it was the time. They needed to be heavy, like you said, Scott, at the beginning. Heavy metal and Dungeons and Dragons both at the time were being focused on. This does remind me of one thing, and I know we're running out of time, but it does remind me of one thing, which is the arc of going from combat as war to combat as sport. I'm being purely speculative here. I make no causal claims, but if you allow me pure speculation.
Speculate.
I don't think it's an accident that the first decade of D&D, roughly, is more combat as war. And even while the rule set remains in place until 2000 or so, you start seeing, in my view, an evolution into more combat as play starting in the 80s. And I would like to propose, in a purely speculative way, that one of the reasons for that is because at that time, and I'm speaking to myself, Dungeons & Dragons is starting to grow up alongside the first wave of video games, you do see more combat as play showing up in these video games. And I think the influence goes in both directions, but I would be shocked for myself. I liked fighting things and beating them, and I brought that mentality into my D&D play.
I have so much to say on that, and let's look at the time. I would like to say, because I was an early adopter of computer role-playing games. I mean, my moniker everywhere is based on my favorite game of all time, which is 1979's The Temple of Apshai. Actually, Temple of Apshai, there's no though. That's my favorite game of all time. But I'm sitting behind my, I've got Ultima, I've got Wizardry behind me, and what I think is really interesting is people often complain, like Wizardry just came out in a reformatted edition, and people are like kind of complaining about it. They're like, this is an extremely capricious game. Like if I go walk down this thing and I open up this one, there's 75 of these like oozes, and they just completely annihilate the party, and I've got to start all over again. Now, what those people don't know is that in 1980, as soon as that happened, what you did is you turned off your Apple computer and you didn't let it to save the file. That was the hack that we used. We used it for all of those, Wizardry, Bard's Tale. But it's interesting to me that we're talking about the entanglement, because yes, computer role-playing games, I mean, and we talked in this podcast before that one of the one of those Venn diagrams of people that played tabletop role playing games is they were always hobbyists, they're always simulationists, and so they were often just as interested in computers as they were tabletop role playing game systems, because both were very much interested in kind of simulating realities in some way. But what I think is interesting, as soon as you mentioned about how combat is war, I would actually say the first instances of computer role playing games still did stick to that function
100%.
of
100%. Yeah.
of combat as war, but then they found that people were going to be more interested if they could get through these games, right? They did start to find, and then I think in some ways they might have led the tabletop role playing game to follow a little bit. Again, I'd use the term entanglement, which is one was inspiring the other inspiring. These simulations of realities, they were, whether they were digital or analog, they're absolutely having enormous influences on one another.
Right. It's my favorite early game, which was not graphic game, which was Zork, and how many
Oh,
times in
wow.
Zork did you just like, oh, the lights went off. You're likely to be eaten by a group. Like the lights went
Yeah.
off. I can't. But that was old school D&D. Our torches ran. We have no more torches. You are screwed.
Yeah.
But I agree completely. There was influence both directions. But that's worth. If someone hasn't written the book, there's the book right there. Is the examination of how Dungeons and Dragons influenced early video games and how video games influence early Dungeons and Dragons.
I found Satan in Dragon 28.
Did you find it? Okay, I was
So-
wondering. So it's Dragon 28, but then it's reprinted, I think, in Best of
Yeah,
Dragon. But
let me
what are his
do a little brief, very brief reading here. This is by Alexander von Thorn, and it is titled "The Politics of Hell."
Yes,
And
yes.
it begins with an author's note. The following article cannot be considered the official doctrine of either Advanced Dungeons and Dragons or the Roman Catholic Church. However, it is compatible with AD&D, and except for the parts about Asmodeus, it is not in conflict with the works of demonology as generally accepted by Catholic exorcists, thus enjoying tacit approval by the Church. However, this article does not have a nihil obstat, which is a church term meaning a work found not morally objectionable by the Church. Much of it is original, and it approaches the subject from a different angle than a religious tract would, and should not be considered as such. The rise of Asmodeus is not documented in any major text on demonology, but very little original work on the subject has been done since the Middle Ages, so it is possible that the situation has changed. Perhaps Mr. Gygax has more accurate sources of information.
Dun, dun, dun. How many hit points? I gotta remember. Was it 666?
Regrettably, it is 333.
Oh, that's terrible. Okay, so that's a sort of nod, I guess.
Here, I'll share my screen.
Yeah.
But it is interesting to me that they went for 333.
I guess 666 would make no sense in the lower. I mean, that's 333 is already huge. I mean, 666 is basically might as well just have an infinite amount of hit points because that is a huge number of hit points for lower editions.
Whoa! Do you hear music?
I don't hear music, but the fact that you're hearing music makes me that's a great moment here, Ben. Maybe
is weird.
Yeah, maybe
But
look at that.
That's what happens when you open up these old books. Suddenly, strange organs begin playing. That's just in your head. This is why you can't play Dungeons and Dragons, folks.
So I won't read the whole thing, but I'll point out Satan's frequency is very rare. His armor class is -8.
Yeah.
Move whatever is necessary.
That's amazing right there.
Yeah. And intelligence is godlike. And I'm going to stop sharing and see if the music that I'm hearing goes away. It hasn't, which makes me really concerned. I'm like,
well, it was inevitable that this happens. We bring up the Satan stats, and now there's music being played. Hopefully, it's Ozzy Osbourne or something like that.
I'm only relieved that when I take the headphones off, it goes away. So I don't know what's going on here, but we're getting to end of showtime. So, Chris, can we do this again next week?
Let's do it again next week. Okay. Seems like we've got a lot of territory to cover.
Okay, that's fantastic. Is there anything that you would like to plug or brag about? I'll put your TED Talk in the show notes. Anything else?
No, the TED Talk's great. Yeah, eventually I'm going to be publishing a book on Dungeons & Dragons ethics and leadership, but that is so far from seeing the light of day. You'll have to have me back on in 2 years when the show's continuing, and I'll talk about that then.
Oh, that's really cool. And that was D&D and leadership?
Yeah, the working title is Dungeons & Dragons Ethics and Leadership. But it's talking about how you can use Dungeons & Dragons. It's what Scott was talking about in some sense, how you can use Dungeons & Dragons and the experiences of Dungeons & Dragons to learn some interesting lessons about leadership and ethics, moral leadership.
All right. I'm going to briefly say that, hey, I backed a Kickstarter by a first-time game designer. It's called Sentience. I'm not being paid to say this in any way, but it's about
It's
androids
AI,
who are
right?
becoming, yeah, it's about androids waking up and becoming sentient, but they're in a world where everyone still thinks they're basically like mindless automatons, which I think is really cool. I can't think of a game that does that, and the art is amazing. Scott, could you tell people about the Patreon?
Didn't the Kickstarter that you just mentioned, is that based on real life? Is that even fantasy or
I was going
science
to say
fiction
this
anymore at
is
this
to
point?
prepare us.
Yeah, yeah, right. It's interpolating us into what is eventually an inevitable, right? So we have a Patreon. You absolutely should join it, especially if you love these things. And again, the Patreon not only gives you access to our Discord, where we're going to talk more and more about combat as war and combat as sport, but it also provides you with access to a lot of the seminars that Ben has been doing recently at Gen Con, some of the speeches and presentations that he's been doing. So you can give through the Patreon and becoming a member of that, you can get specific insights into the secret world of Dungeons and Dragons production, I suppose,
Yeah.
and the history of Dungeons and Dragons, I should say as well. You were able to slay dragons better. I've got nothing going on except as always, I like to talk both baseball and Dungeons and Dragons in the Discord. So I'm hoping, and I'm always on there, so I'm hoping to have more conversations. And I think this has been one of the most fantastic episodes, just because I think there's so many different directions that we can continue talking even after the show is over on Discord. So we'd love to see folks on there.
All right, I'm going to wrap up by saying, Professor Robichaud, thanks so much. We'll talk to you next week. Scott, you have a fantastic Sunday.
You do the same.